Today we're talking to Dr. Josh Korzenik about the relationship between PSC and diet and whether or not it will be possible to detect the disease via smell in the future.
Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, it's interesting because often people will say that they can tell they're having a flare because there's a distinct odor.
Hello, my name is Niall McKay and welcome to Living with PSC, a podcast about the rare disease of primary sclerosing cholangitis. Now, PSC causes the bile ducts inside and outside the liver to become scarred, narrowed and eventually blocked, and leads to liver cirrhosis. In this podcast, we aim to dispel some of the myths about the disease. Welcome, Dr. Josh Korzenik. Dr. Korzenik, would you like to tell us your title and where you practice out of, please?
Certainly. So thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you. And I'm a gastroenterologist. I direct the Crohn's and Colitis Center at Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School. And in addition, also direct the Resnek Family Center for Research in PSC.
And I believe it's very unusual because you're one of the few sort of specialist PSC clinics that I know of, worldwide, let alone, but also in the United States. Is that correct?
I think so. I think that we're sort of very fortunate to have received a very generous gift from the Resnek family and to support our research. And so we're really trying to, what that allows us to do is to really have a broad integrated program ranging from translational research through epidemiology and into the clinic with a variety of therapies that we're hoping are going to be successful in PSC.
And somewhat unusually as well, you have not only treatment, but you also have a hypothesis around PSC. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that? Sure.
Well, we have a number of hypotheses, but the main one that we're looking at is really a conception of trying to understand ulcerative colitis and trying to understand then how PSC fits into that. And I think part of our goal is to say, in order to understand PSC, we need to understand ulcerative colitis. That's the best clue we have. And in order to understand ulcerative colitis, we need to understand PSC. So we think that both of them hold valuable insights for the other. Certainly there are differences, and why is it that the drugs that work reasonably well for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's don't do much for PSC? And so we've, in explaining what our hypothesis is we can look first at ulcerative colitis and then explain how that might fit in with PSC. So we're saying that there are 3 steps. The first step is that there is a mucus layer, or what we call mucin, that lines the colon, and also lines the biliary tree. So we think as a very initial step, that mucus, which acts as a sort of barrier, so bacteria doesn't get too close to the lining of the intestine, gets degraded by the intestinal bacteria. That then is in itself an issue because bacteria are closer to the lining of the biliary tree or the colon, but also it releases an amino acid called cysteine. So cysteine is an amino acid which is important because it's a precursor for something called hydrogen sulfide. So hydrogen sulfide is what causes, it sort of is a sort of bad odor. That's what rotten eggs smell of. And it is something, though, that is paradoxical because the body uses it in all sorts of wonderful ways when it's produced by the body and tightly controlled. When it's produced in the lumen, whether it's in the biliary tree or in the GI tract, we think it causes all sorts of harm. And having said that, so the first step is this degradation of mucin. The second step is the production of hydrogen sulfide. The issue with hydrogen sulfide is that the body knows that there's going to be hydrogen sulfide around, both because it produces it and expects there's going to be some produced by the bacteria in the gut. And so that it has a fairly robust system to break down the hydrogen sulfide. We think what happens is that there's a second set of products that are produced by the gut bacteria that impair the detoxification of hydrogen sulfide, so that normally that hydrogen sulfide doesn't last long. It gets broken down by enzymes in the colon and in the biliary tree. But we think for other reasons, that process is impaired, levels go up. It then poisons the mitochondria. It does a variety of other things. Mitochondria are sort of the power sources of the cell. And then that creates the inflammatory process. And then you get this whole generation of products and problems. And what is being called an autoimmune disease then may not be, or at least it may not start out that way. And so we're looking at a variety of ways of trying to both study that process, understand if it's correct. And other people have worked in the past on this hypothesis in the 70s and 80s, but it was sort of discarded a long time ago. But there's been a consistent set of data suggesting that this may be a promising pathway.
So is it the mucin, which is the lining, and the microbiota in the stomach produce hydrogen sulfide? Is that how it works?
That's right. And so the bacteria that are increased in this dysbiosis that's been identified in ulcerative colitis and in PSC, and to an extent in Crohn's as well, has been suggested to be those that are increased in hydrogen sulfide production. And I think sometimes some of that gets lost when we do these incredible studies with broad omics that aren't as much hypothesis driven. So we're looking at doing some of these broad analyses. And when we look at things like Veillonella, one of the bacteria that has tended to be increased in PSC, that is sort of notorious in the microbe world as being a hydrogen sulfide producer. But we also want to be somewhat skeptical about our own hypothesis because we don't want to be drinking our own Kool-Aid. So whether we're trying not to look at the data selectively, but looking at it objectively. And certainly there have been previous studies to suggest that hydrogen sulfide producers are increased in ulcerative colitis.
And then this overproduction of hydrogen sulfide creating an imbalance in the mitochondria in the cell, and that is sort of kicking into this kind of autoimmune illness.
When the mitochondria get poisoned, they generate what are called free radicals, and that incites something called the inflammasome, which is a sort of compartment in the cells which are ready and poised to create an inflammatory process. And then you get this whole cycle of injury. And then once in PSC injuries more sort of established, then you have the problem of fibrosis. And does that create its own further set of problems? So we're hoping to identify something that will be at the heart of the inflammatory process and looking at a variety of ways of reversing that.
And would that explain as well the increased risk of cancers in these patients?
So it may be that just inflammation anywhere in the body is an increased risk of cancer, but it is curious because hydrogen sulfide also can cause damage, particularly when it's uncontrolled. Hydrogen sulfide can cause damage to the DNA and has been suggested to be an independent risk factor. So it may be that the hydrogen sulfide contributes to that cancer risk, or it may just be that it's inflammation and the free radical damage that happens may be part of the process as well.
And is it Klebsiella, the other bacteria? Does that play a role in it as well?
Klebsiella is less of one, but certainly the Japanese study was very provocative and very interesting. And it may be, for these things to happen, whether it's ulcerative colitis or PSC, clearly it's not one factor, and a number of things have to collide together to provoke the process. So if we're suggesting 3 different events have to happen at least for for ulcerative colitis to happen, it may be another set of factors that have to collide together to provoke PSC. So it's not just one factor, it's a variety of things that need to happen together to make this a problem.
And where would people like myself who don't have UC but have PSC fit into this? Would that be, because a lot of the time I know sometimes it develops, I know some people who have said that they've developed UC after their transplant, you know what I mean? So
right. So, it's a lot of things to untangle. And presumably that if some of the microbiome that we study is in stool, so it's further on down. We are looking at the oral flora as well, and we'll want to eventually look at it in the small bowel, because it may be that something comes from the colon and works its way. It may be that something works its way up from the colon anyway, but it's not and it doesn't provoke the colitis. Or it may be also that there are factors either from the mouth or small bowel or biliary tree. So we're also looking at culturing bile and trying to understand the microbiome of bile better, because it may be not just what's happening in the colon or higher up, but it may be perhaps more obvious what's right there in bile. But so we're trying to sort of untangle those different factors.
Yeah, because it's like, if you like, it's like a jazz band or a symphony playing as opposed to a soloist, right?
That's right, but not a very good melody, let's say.
Yeah, and is there a role that can you talk maybe a bit about the role of antibiotics in this sort of symphony, if you like?
Yeah, so we certainly when we look at ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, and I should say one of the things also that is different about our group is that there's hepatologists and there's gastroenterologists. So hepatologists are focused really on the liver, and we're focusing on the lumen and the colon and the small bowel. And we've really brought these groups together because we think we have a lot to learn from each other, and we don't want to be too siloed in our own ways. And so when we look at antibiotics in Crohn's, particularly in Crohn's colitis, there's an important role, and they can be effective. When we look at ulcerative colitis, they don't seem to be very effective. And it may be that the damage has already occurred. And so even if you change the microbiome at that point, you really have to be on a longer course of antibiotics. And there's been at least one study where people were on Cipro for 6 months, and it did reduce the risk of flaring. So I think everyone would agree that there is an important role for the microbiome, but it's not as a classic infection where you're colonized, it's caused an inflammatory response, you get rid of that bacteria and all's well. And so the question is then, what's the role of antibiotics for PSC? And we don't know. The data has been in part promising, in part discouraging when we've looked at certainly vancomycin and we did a small study, just 10 people with PSC, but got vancomycin for a year. Some were early disease, some were late. We really, and it was at a hefty dose. And we looked at MRs, we looked at certainly blood tests, and we didn't see any real signal there. A few people got better in one area, but not in another, meaning their liver test looked a little bit better, but certainly not something that we were particularly excited about. That was all that promising. But there's enough data out there that we're very eager to have the study that's being done out at Mayo in vancomycin to be followed through. And there's certainly a lot of data out there suggestive of vancomycin as having an impact, which is interesting in that it's not absorbed. Very little is likely to get to the biliary tree, and more of it is getting to the colon. So how that fits together, does it fit together? And certainly it seemed, at least in pediatric disease, to be very impactful. Now, we had done a study also a little while ago of fecal transplant as another way of trying to alter the microbiome. Also a relatively small pilot study, about 10 patients. And these were in the earlier days of fecal transplant where we did just sort of a one-time dosing. We have gotten away from that and we do more sort of ongoing dosing, but we saw a few patients that had some minor improvements in their liver function tests. But again, nothing dramatic, and it may be that really we need to do a more persistent change. I think that ultimately manipulation of the microbiome is hopefully going to be of benefit to a significant number of people, but what does that change need to be? What is the dysbiosis? What is off about someone's microbiome, and where is it off? Is it in the biliary tree? Is it in the colon? Is it in the small bowel? And how does all that fit together? We need to sort out.
So would there be any thought that perhaps certain antibiotics may sort of kick off the disease? Or
yes, and there have been some reports of PSC associated with particular antibiotics. And certainly when we look at Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, we know that prior use of antibiotics can be a risk in a broad way, and they sort of discount the year or so before because that might have been sort of early disease. But further back before that, it can be. Now, these are blunt tools, and when you use an antibiotic, it's not as if it wipes out all of your intestinal bacteria. Some things go down, but other things actually go up in the face of antibiotics, because when you remove some or reduce certain bacteria, there's more of the sort of substrates or foods that the certain other bacteria prefer, and then those can actually increase, and they're impervious to that particular antibiotic. So it alters the microbiome, it reduces their sort of diversity, which is one of the hallmarks of these diseases as well. So there's fewer different types.
So then, I mean, because certainly for PSC patients, antibiotics is how you keep the infection out of the bile duct or the biliary tree. So there might be a cause and effect happening at the same time. Would there be, or cause and treatment?
No, I think it's a two-edged sword. So we're interested in what's wrong with the microbiome and in what way do we want to improve it. But I think that yes, it's a complex kind of mixture in there. And so when we use something like an antibiotic, it's a very blunt tool. Can we identify the bad players and be more selective? Can we find the good players and be more selective? And can we sort of knock out the bad ones and add the good ones? Well, we're not nearly smart enough yet to understand what those are. So I think hopefully collectively, the sort of all of the people working in this area will be able to work together to understand that better and then really come closer. But so we're looking at antibiotics. We're looking at, can we manipulate what the bacteria are doing, meaning if there's a functional issue, we're looking at ways of dealing with this hydrogen sulfide as our next study, but that's not going to start for until probably the summer. And then another way of trying to manipulate the microbiome is diet. So we're looking at diet as well.
And certainly some of the sort of mysteries around PSC, for example, or that smokers get it slightly less, and that people who drink coffee get it slightly less, and stuff like that. Some of these things some of your hypothesis would fit in with those things, wouldn't it? It would explain those things where they've never been explained before.
It could. Coffee is a little bit different, but I think smoking may have impacts on the microbiome that would be consistent to what we're looking at. But I would say that I wouldn't, at this point, rely too heavily on our hypothesis, because even though it fits, and without hopefully contorting what we're looking at too much, we think it does make sense, and we're looking at that in particular in terms of effects on the microbiome. And we're hoping that we'll see. We're engaged in a number of studies to try to understand that, but I think it may be that the impact of smoking on the microbiome may be a critical effect, because it's curious. It's not just that, say, in ulcerative colitis, a smoker is protected, but when you quit smoking, the risk goes up higher than if you had never smoked. And so it's a particularly sort of, it's hard to postulate just sort of a temporary effect. It has to be something that's impacting it in a broader way, and so trying to understand that is a challenge.
I see, and I would. That's very interesting.
And I should add that in Crohn's, it's the opposite. So for Crohn's disease, smoking for worsening disease, for faster recurrence after surgery, and a variety of things. So there's a real sort of split between ulcerative colitis and Crohn's.
And what's the relationship like? I mean, how many people with Crohn's have PSC, and how many people with? I know 80% of people with PSC have UC or Crohn's, but how does it work the other way around? Because there's a lot of people with Crohn's, isn't there?
Yes, it's at least in the United States, and it's roughly the same elsewhere. It was thought to be maybe about 1.6 million Americans have Crohn's or UC, and now that's a recent estimate, or a couple of years ago, by the CDC, has estimated perhaps double that. So it may be more like 3 million, roughly 50-50. In terms of PSC, it's been thought that it's a little bit more ulcerative colitis, and it tends to be more ulcerative colitis, but other studies have suggested that it's significantly present in Crohn's as well. So if it's typically 3 to 5%, 3 to 7% in ulcerative colitis, some of the numbers in Crohn's, some of the studies have suggested a little bit less, some have suggested more. And it tends to be, there's a little bit of a split there too, that it tends to be, and this isn't uniform, that the ulcerative colitis tends to be more male. Males develop PSC, and in Crohn's, it may be a little bit more women develop it. And the course tends to be a little bit milder in women a little bit older who develop PSC in association with Crohn's, compared to men who develop PSC in relationship to ulcerative colitis.
So, can you tell us a little bit about the dietary studies that you've been running, and if you've found any data from that that's useful?
Yeah, so we're excited about the study for a number of reasons. One is just because it's a dietary study, and I think it's an area that's been neglected. And in ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, and in certainly in PSC, and we assume it's sort of intuitive.
And sorry, I just want to stop you there for a second. Tell us about the actual study, because it's a study of what is the diet?
So we're looking at two different diets. We're looking at one diet which is called the specific carbohydrate diet, and we're comparing that to sort of a vegan diet or a low protein diet. And they're sort of polar opposites, meaning one is high protein, low carb. The other one is lower protein. And that's really in sync with this hydrogen sulfide hypothesis, and trying to see if we lower the precursors for hydrogen sulfide, can we have an impact on the outcome.
Just to recap on it, is that people who eat, if you eat less meat, fish, and eggs, for example, you're going to produce less of the hydrogen sulfide, and if you produce less of that, you're hoping to see if there's a relationship between less hydrogen sulfide and less PSC or less.
That's right, but if you take in the same amount of protein, say by soy, it may still do the same thing. So we're looking particularly in the liver, and in PSC, taurine, which is another sulfur-related amino acid, may be particularly important. And when you look at the subtypes of amino acids or of bile, it's really the taurine-associated bile that seems to be slightly increased in PSC, and we've seen that in our own studies as well. And so what's interesting about taurine is that in the gut, it may be cysteine is more important in terms of generating hydrogen sulfide. In the liver, we're suggesting it may be taurine, both because of that data, but also when you take in protein that has taurine, excess taurine that's not used by the body is excreted in the biliary tree. And the sources of taurine, for the most part, tend to be more animal protein. So it's protein, but it's particularly animal protein, and it tends to be dairy and meat. And so our hope is that by reducing that and reducing protein altogether, less taurine is going into the liver, less hydrogen sulfide is being generated, and then hopefully there's an impact on reduced inflammation and also changes to the microbiome that will then associate to who gets an improvement and which kind of diet may be better. Now, it could be that both diets have an impact because people are paying more attention to their diet and not eating other foods, and that will be something else to sort out. But we'll see. We don't have data yet because we're keeping ourselves blinded until we finish enrollment, which we're hoping in the next couple months to complete enrollment, and then people will be sort of continue their involvement in the study. And so we're hoping that by the summer we'll have completed all of our enrollment and data collection.
And do you collect data from people who are post-transplant?
So at this point, we haven't. We're certainly very, very interested in that. And we sort of have a couple people who are in that category that we're sort of holding on the side. Our assumption is that it's really the same process, the same disease, but because of the other medications on board, it makes it a little bit harder to study some of the microbiome issues.
I mean, I must say that, just on an anecdotal level, I myself have gone through all of these diets and I can't really figure out it. I could eat myself sick, but I can't eat myself well.
And it's been certainly with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, it's been a mystery in terms of how diet impacts on things. And I think in the same way, we know what a bad diet can be, but we don't really know what a good diet is yet.
Got you. Yeah. That's fascinating. Would there be, I mean, this is a silly question maybe, but would there be a relationship between how your stool would smell? Like, would the hydrogen...
No, it is a really interesting question. So it could be, and certainly with PSC, it's probably more of a challenge. In Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, it's interesting because often people will say that they can tell they're having a flare because there's a distinct odor. And there have been a number of studies using what's called an electronic nose, which picks up certain things which are volatile organic compounds to try to distinguish people, say, with, I don't think it's been done in PSC, but more with a flare with ulcerative colitis or Crohn's compared to those without. Now, hydrogen sulfide has a very brief half-life, so it disappears remarkably rapidly, so it's hard to study directly, and even in those studies, it will be gone. So you would smell not likely hydrogen sulfide directly, though you might, but you would see sort of secondary products of that. So, but there are lots of reasons, say if there's fat malabsorption, as that can happen in PSC and in IBD, that creates odors too. But certainly I've always thought it's curious that people will tell me that they can tell they're having a flare because there's a change in the odor, and I wonder whether that could be hydrogen sulfide.
Would you advise people to take a particular diet, for example, or what would you advise them to do?
The jury's out right now, and even in our small pilot study, we don't have our data back yet. So as much as we want to get to a point where we can understand what the impact of diet is on PSC, we're not anywhere close at this point. We're hoping that this study we're doing is a first step towards that end, and can begin to at least understand how to study it in more detail and how to make these studies inform the community more broadly. But I wouldn't say on the basis of what we know so far, we can say all that much.
I understand. Yeah. I mean, I would personally warn people against thinking that other than, reducing your stress, upping your exercise and having a healthy, balanced diet that you should, because the temptation, of course, with a rare disease like this, or maybe with any illness, is to try and find something some magic pill, some magic bullet that's going to solve you, and you can end up driving yourself mad trying to think, should I be eating, And
there's also the other side where people somehow blame themselves for saying, well, it's my own fault that I have this because I'm not on the right diet, and we don't have, that's if it is a dysbiosis, you can shift your microbiome, but you can't necessarily get bacteria that aren't there to be present. And it may be that it's also much more complicated. It certainly is much more complicated, so that one diet for one person may not be beneficial. It may be that there are broad patterns, and there may be several different patterns of what the right diet needs to be.
But there's certainly research to show that, dark green leafy vegetables help your microbiome, isn't there? Or
well, again, it's yes, there's certainly, again, there are diets that are more sort of, let's see, healthy, and some that aren't as much. But it may differ from person to person and from disease state and depending on medication. So it's complicated, and doing these studies are complicated, and it may depend on what microbiome you're starting with and where you need to get to, and we don't understand that enough yet. But yes, we're hoping that even in the absence of a comprehensive theory to explain everything, we'll be able to begin to get some outlines of what a better diet for PSC might be.
Well, this is, I can't tell you how fascinating this is, and stuff that I haven't heard before, certainly about hydrogen sulfide and all that kind of stuff. So it's been great. Is there anything that I should have asked that I didn't ask?
I'm very optimistic. I think that there's a growing sense of a focus on PSC, both because of PSC Partners, because of work of the Norway group, which I think has really coalesced a lot of people in an effort, and people in the United States, and we want to see ourselves very much as part of that effort to grow the community and be as collaborative as possible. And so I think that there is sort of an essential group and mass and people together to really try to make this effort successful. So whether it's what we're doing or what other groups are doing, I think that there's a lot of activity, and I think that we're going to have some successful therapies in the near future.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time today, and I will really look forward to hearing the results of those studies.
Absolutely. So thank you very much. This is really great. Thanks for the opportunity, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this week. For more information about PSC and for a list of people and topics we'll be covering in the near future, please go to www.pscpartners.org. That's www.pscpartners.org. PSC Partners is a non-profit organisation dedicated to providing education and support to primary sclerosing cholangitis patients. There is information and resources on the website. There is a conference once a year. There is a private Facebook group that you can also join. Also, please join our patient registry. This is an anonymous database that provides research support to the medical community who are researching this disease. Thank you very much for listening.